Okay, and welcome to week 8 of American History Hybrid. Take the next few moments to look over the possible words or ideas that relate to the Vietnam War. Next, we'll take a look at this week's learning objectives. So first, we're going to take a look at President Kennedy's increased involvement in Vietnam. We're going to look at controversial issues that surround the resolution of Gulf of Tonkin under Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. You describe the strategies U.S. forces used throughout Vietnam War at the beginning and towards the end. And we'll also look, with that being said, Vietnamization, explain why some Americans opposed the war, and describe how government responded to some of these oppositional movements. Explain how the Tet Offense led to a lack of confidence in the U.S. government, and then looking also at President Nixon's attempt to end the Vietnam War, and then finally the ceasefire that was ended the war, ended U.S. involvement in the war in '73, and ultimately led to the communist takeover of Vietnam. And then lastly, take a look at the long-term effects on the American people. All right, let's begin. First, again, let's take a look at linking into previous history, things that we've seen in previous history that could help us better understand the start to the Vietnam War. Again, think about what began the Spanish-American War. Secondly, what led to the U.S. entry to World War I. What events led U.S. into World War II. And then what led us into the Korean War. And here are the answers. And think about similarities as we begin to take a look at the Vietnam War. First, an overview. The war was a very painful war. The U.S. involvement in the war was originally initiated with John F. Kennedy's involvement, but keeping in mind that really what had happened is that Indochina was controlled by the French, and then there was a Viet Minh movement, which was an independent movement in 1949, where they declared independence from France. Although during this time President Truman did support France and the Allies to stop the spread of communism, but again, the spread of communism in 1949 in China had warned that communism could spread through the domino theory, which we looked at previously. And then we also see during this time the rise of Ho Chi Minh. And again, the Ho Chi Minh we'll later talk about as we enter the Vietnam War. Also, the human, society, and political costs of the war. There are many costs that we'll look at today as well, or this week rather. Okay, back to the domino theory. Again, that started under Truman's watch, but again reinforced by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Again, domino theory stressed that any country that it was concerned that when one country was communist, then it would then knock down to another country, and it would continue to spread as though if a stack of dominoes were to unfold. And then we see later in 1965, U.S. supports the South Vietnamese movement, which is a democratic movement led by Ngoc Dong Diem. Again, that support was the former government of the French, so it gains recognition that the U.S. would support Ngoc Dong Diem during this time. And John F. Kennedy follows the same policies as Eisenhower. However, we begin to see the first movement of troops, or support of troops, under Kennedy's watch. And what leads U.S. into war? The disputed Gulf of Tonkin.
On August 2nd, the destroyer Maddox reported it was attacked by a North Vietnamese patrol boat. It was an act of aggression against us. We were in international waters. I sent officials from the Defense Department out, and we recovered pieces of North Vietnamese shells that were clearly identified as North Vietnamese shells from the deck of the Maddox. So there was no question in my mind that it occurred. But in any event, we didn't respond. 2 days later, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, two destroyers, reported they were attacked.
Where are these torpedoes coming from? Well, we don't know. Presumably from these unidentified craft.
There were sonar soundings, torpedoes had been detected, other indications of attack from patrol boats. We spent about 10 hours that day trying to find out what in the hell had happened. At one point, the commander of the ship said, "We're not certain of the attack." Another point, they said, "Yes, we're absolutely positive." And then finally, late in the day, Admiral Sharp said, "Yes, we're certain it happened." So I reported this to Johnson, and as a result, there were bombing attacks on targets in North Vietnam. Johnson said, "We may have to escalate. I'm not going to do it without congressional authority." And he put forward a resolution, the language of which gave complete authority to the president to take the nation to war. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Now, let me go back to the August 4th attack.
Well, there apparently been at least 9 torpedoes in the water. All missed. Yeah. No, I don't. Wait a minute now. I'm not so sure about this number of engaged. Right. We'd have to check it out here. He said many of the reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports. Okay, well, I'll come with the McNamara of this. That's the best I can give you, Dave. Sorry. It does appear now that a lot of these torpedo attacks were from the sonar man, you see. And they get keyed up to a thing like this. Everything they hear on the sonar is a torpedo. You're pretty sure there was a torpedo attack, though? Oh, no doubt about that, I think. No doubt about that.
No, it was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
Okay, so again, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, President Lyndon B. Johnson claimed that the attacks were provoked by the North Vietnamese, when in actuality, the United States had fired first. Again, his approach to the Vietnam. We see it with Operation Rolling Thunder. When the war escalates after the Gulf of Tonkin, keep in mind there are over 2 million soldiers that serve in Vietnam, and the average soldier is young, poor, and less educated. Nonetheless, they'll create a selective service draft where we'll see drafting similar to that of World War II. And with the Operation Rolling Thunder, what it was calling for was a quick victory with a bombing campaign. However, that was ill assumed, never occurred. So then Tonkin will order the escalation of ground war, and the ground war will start with search and destroy missions, but before they did that, they would have planes come through the various fields of Vietnam and drop defoliants, which are chemicals that strip the land of all foliage and vegetation. Again, these bomb raids were, again, to eliminate the guerrilla warfare against surprise attacks by the North Vietnamese. They also were utilized with the search and destroy to, again, find the Viet Cong and then punish the Viet Cong. And again, we see the ill effects of napalm, which again is a defoliant that was widely used during the Vietnam War, and the lasting effects it will have well beyond the Vietnam War to the locals of Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, there we go.
The enemy in Vietnam is all too often invisible, striking without warning from the shadows. But tonight, the face of the enemy in rare films of the Viet Cong in action. The film was shot by a communist cameraman processed in Vietnam, taken to Paris for editing, now shown for the first time on American television. Charles Kuralt, who has covered Vietnam's war in the field, is the narrator.
This is propaganda film, properly heroic as propaganda film should be. But under the layers of singing warriors marching gaily to battle, there are also some truths about the enemy in South Vietnam. Some truths about the kind of enemy which uses as weapons the terrain and the night and the weather, which has proved that sampans and even in some circumstances bicycles can be used to better effect than tanks. And an enemy which has waged a markedly successful war against the larger force which we trained. This is an enemy which steals from us the weapons of the 20th century and supplements them with the weapons of the 16th century, the crossbow. The spear launcher.
Okay, this gives you a little glimpse as to the help from the Cambodian and Laos. Again, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was to bring weapons and supplies into South Vietnam. More than 300,000 people worked full-time to maintain the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The hardships and delusionment of war, again, the guerrilla warfare. The North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, had tunnels that were quite expansive throughout the war. Keep in mind, during this war, the ground warfare, many North Vietnamese had supplied the South, and so many South Vietnamese had joined the Viet Cong, the north side. And oftentimes, these search and destroy missions were to drive out the Viet Cong from their hideouts, but the hideouts were very difficult to find simply because of their expansive tunnels. And they had a very difficult time distinguishing between North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, and then South Vietnamese. And this led to frustration and moral decline. Again, Vietnam was the People's War. We saw it, or the Vietnamese saw it as a civil war amongst Vietnam. The Viet Cong versus the South ARV. The fighting was very extensive. And again, the conversion to Viet Cong again spread to the South Vietnamese continuously. We see from the beginning of the war in 65 through the end of the war of 73. All right, opposition to government policy. The main place we see it is on organized on university campuses. And on organization on university campuses, we also see for the first time in American history a war that publicizes casualties. Again, the casualties will be quite alarming to the mass public as they see the catastrophes happening in Vietnam. News programs showed gruesome images and suggested that U.S. troops could not win the war. Again, this prompted doubt in many Americans, and then the opposition started on college campuses. And we have the Doves that support ending the war, and then the Hawks that support continuing with the war.
Mosques set up in the major prisons throughout the United States. In the prisons.
Shortly put, are the black Muslims taking you for a ride?
I said not black Muslims, Muslims.
I beg your pardon, are the Muslims taking you for a ride?
No, the white people have been taking us for a ride for the past 400 years in America. The Muslims are straightening me up and teaching me the truth and saving my life so that I can see the hereafter. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us the religion of Islam, and I will die for it and give everything. But as far as taking me for a ride concerned, I've been the one that was taking me for a ride and still taking my people for a ride is the white people.
Tell me, champ, would you have been prepared to go into the army if it hadn't been for the Vietnam War?
No, under no conditions do we take part in wars and take lives of other humans.
Okay, so again, we look back at LBJ's Great Society. The war will reach its height in 68. The Tet Offensive will occur, and that will be known as the turning point of the war. The Tet Offensive, again, creates disbelief in the American public, in America's government, saying, determining that we are winning the war and we are going to end the war and win the war ultimately. And then we also see the Living Room War, which is already mentioned. Again, that's where we see the gruesome images portrayed in the casualties in the Vietnam War. And then again, there's going to be a credibility gap with the American public and the government. And then we see an increase of government taxation to fund the war, and this ultimately will lead to the 70s recession we'll talk about later. The Tet Offensive. Again, it's Vietnam's most important holiday. It begins on the 30th of January, and both sides, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, and the South Vietnamese, agreed to a ceasefire. So American troops during this time rest at ease. However, it was a setup by the Viet Cong, and again they had surprise attacks, and it was their biggest offensive, where they launched several attacks at once, targeting notable places such as the U.S. Embassy and headquarters. The effects of the Tet Offense. Again, we look at who's the victor. South Vietnamese were beat back, and North Vietnamese and both the Viet Cong failed, but really did they fail? Many would say no, where the Viet Cong did lose a lot of men, 10,000 casualties, but again they were forced to retreat. But the loser in this was the credibility of the American government. And again, we can see why, despite the victory and casualties and the retreating of the Viet Cong, why the U.S., again, during this time looked at as a unilateral decision to declare war on the North Vietnamese. And LBJ is not going to seek renomination because, again, he started out with the Great Society, which was domestic issues, and then towards the end of his second term, or his elected first term, he begins to focus on foreign policy, which again loses the support of the American public. All right, things to think about from the first two sections of chapter 33. Okay, again, talking about Nixon's war. Again, Nixon's war, we'll see in 68, low support of the My Lai massacre. He'll try to cover it up, again, dissuading the public. And we begin to see the first withdrawals in 69. Again, inheriting the problem of Lyndon B. Johnson. Fighting, losing battle. We see Vietnamization. Again, the gradual transition of power to South Vietnamese. This was the policy this is the policy of Nixon, which involved turning over the fighting to the South Vietnamese while gradually pulling U.S. troops out. Again, this would bring peace and honor, according to Nixon. But we also see bombings of Cambodian people during this time. And again, remember, they were helping support the South Vietnamese through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We see escalation of protests. Probably one of the most significant protests on Kent State in Ohio in 1970, where several students had protested against the American government, and the American government, the National Guard troops, had killed 4 and injured 9 other students. Okay, we'll bypass this. And the Long War continues. We'll see another large attack by the Viet Cong. Again, Vietnamization is not working. Nixon is reelected in 72, and also we see the increased attacks. One of the attacks known as the Christmas Day bombing, and by this time in 1972, over 60% of Americans were against the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers were documents that revealed that the government had frequently misled the American people about the course of the war. The United States pulls out of the Vietnam War. A ceasefire is declared in 73. U.S. forces leave Vietnam, and in 75, South Vietnam is unified with the North, declaring it a communist nation. During this time, some of the effects, there will be a mass migration of what is known as the Boat People, Vietnamese refuge, where 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians will have died. Meanwhile, 1.5 refugees will flee, most of them to America. In fact, half of them, according to Holt Text, were 730,000 settled in the United States. When the soldiers came home, they were not treated like any other war. They were treated as the enemy. Many soldiers were attacked by the public for, again, the tragedies that had taken place in Vietnam, and it led to many soldiers turning to drugs and turning to other troubled decisions in life, and with that being said, many returning soldiers could not find work, and they had a hard time adjusting to life, and we saw an increase of homelessness. And there was also problems linked to the Agent Orange that they were subjected to. Okay, go back to the learning outcomes for the week and make sure you have a clear understanding and provide historically accurate examples for each of the objectives listed.